Colorado Territory, early spring of 1874. Snow still clung to the edges of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the wind coming down from the peaks carried a bite, even as the sun stretched longer across the plains below. Shiloh Rainer gritted her teeth and braced herself against a contraction that stole the breath from her lungs. She was alone, knees in the straw, hands clenched around the edge of an old feed trough. The stable smelled of horses and damp wood, and the shadows grew longer with the setting sun. Her riding cloak was soaked through, her boots caked with mud. Her horse had collapsed 2 miles back. She had run the rest of the way, praying the man who once promised her safety still lived out here, but he was not in the cabin. No fire, no sign of him. She had barely made it to the barn before the pain brought her to her knees. Now the baby was coming. She screamed once, raw and loud, then bit into her sleeve to keep from doing it again. Her body shuddered with effort. She had helped birth colts and calves before, but this was something else deeper, lonelier. And then, a sound, footsteps crunching across the snow outside, boots fast. A man's voice, low and sharp with alarm. Shiloh, she blinked up, vision blurring. A tall figure filled the open barn doors, backlit by the setting sun. He dropped his saddlebag and ran forward without hesitation. "Isael McCade," she whispered, recognizing the lean face and dark eyes, the same ones that had looked at her that summer 5 years ago like she was something worth staying for. "You came back." "I never left," he said, already shrugging off his coat. "You are not doing this alone." The pain came again, sharp and fast, and she cried out. Isael dropped to his knees beside her, laying his coat over her legs. He looked around fast, then grabbed an armful of fresh straw from the corner and spread it beside her, thick and warm. He helped her shift onto it gently, his hands steady even as hers shook. "You will never be alone again," he said, voice rough with feeling. She could not speak. The next wave came, and the world narrowed to pain and pressure. Isael guided her through it, his arms bracing her back, his voice whispering things she could not fully hear. Just the sound of him there, solid and close, was enough. And then, at last, a cry split the air. A baby's cry, Shiloh sobbed, half from relief, half from disbelief. Isael wrapped the tiny, red-faced infant in his shirt and laid the child in her arms. She held the baby close, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It is a girl," Isael said softly. She nodded, brushing the damp hair from the baby's head. "Her name is Clara," Isael smiled, kneeling beside them in the straw. "Clara Rainer, she has your eyes." Shiloh looked up at him. He had always carried a quiet strength, but now there was something more in him, something that had been missing before. He was older, worn by the years, but it made him steadier, real. "I did not know where else to go," she whispered. "You came to the right place." The barn was quiet now, except for the heavy breathing of the mare in the next stall and the soft coo of the baby. Isael stood, moved to the corner, and pulled out a blanket from a crate. He wrapped it around Shiloh's shoulders, then sat beside her, back against the stall wall. She leaned into him, too tired to speak. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Too long." He did not push. His arm rested around her as the last of the daylight disappeared and the barn was lit only by the lantern he lit near the door. "I did not know you were with child," he said after a while. "I did not mean to be," she said, voice flat. "The man who gave me her left before I could tell him. I worked where I could, stayed where I was not chased off. When I heard you had a cabin out here, I thought maybe—" "You thought right." She looked at him, searching his face. "You still mean that?" He met her eyes. "I mean it," she swallowed hard. "I have nothing, no money, nowhere to go. You have Clara," he said, "and you have me." She blinked hard. "Why?" He looked down at Clara, then back at her. "Because 5 years ago I should have asked you to stay. I never stopped thinking about you. You showing up here, I do not think that is chance." Shiloh pressed her lips to Clara's head and her heart ached in her chest. "I cannot ask you to take this on," she said quietly. "You did not ask," he said. "I offered." She looked at him again, and this time she did not look away. The lines in his face had deepened, but his eyes were the same honest, steady, true. "Do you want to stay?" he asked. I do not want to leave, she said. He nodded once, then leaned in and touched his forehead gently to hers. The barn stayed quiet, warm in its own way despite the wind outside, the three of them cocooned in the straw. It was not how she imagined her baby would come into the world, but somehow it felt right. Isael stayed beside her through the night, feeding the stove in the corner, holding Clara when her arms grew tired, making coffee at first light. He did not ask for anything. He just stayed, and Shiloh, for the first time in a long while, believed she might not have to keep running. Not anymore. The morning after Clara's birth broke cold and pale. Light spilled through the gaps in the barn siding, catching on particles of dust and straw that hung suspended in the still air. Isael had stoked the stove twice since midnight, each time careful not to wake Shiloh or the baby. Now he crouched near the ash pan, coaxing a thin flame to life beneath a blackened tin kettle. Behind him, Shiloh stirred. He heard the slow shift of her weight, the soft rustling of blankets, then the quiet, rhythmic sound of her rocking Clara against her chest. "You been up long?" she asked, voice rough with sleep. "Not long. Fire needed feeding. Water'll be hot soon." She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, but not uncomfortably. Isael stood and crossed to her, resting one knee beside the pallet he'd laid for her in the corner. He didn't reach for Clara, only looked. The baby's face had settled, no longer red and scrunched, but soft and still. Her tiny fist curled beneath her mother's collarbone. "Her color's better," he said quietly. Shiloh nodded, eyes on her daughter. She nursed twice. "Strong little thing." Isael hesitated, then asked, "You hungry? Starved? I'll ride into town in a bit. There's still credit under my name at the mercantile." She looked up sharply. "I don't want your money. It's not charity. It's what people do when they share a roof." "You're not obligated to us, Isael." He leaned back on his heels. "Obligations got nothing to do with it." She didn't answer, but her hand shifted over Clara's back, rubbing slow circles. Isael stood and moved toward the barn doors. The sky outside had brightened but stayed heavy with cloud. Snow had crusted along the fence rails during the night, glittering now in the soft light. "I'll be gone a few hours," he said. "You'll be all right here. I've got water and blankets." "I'll manage." He hesitated with his hand on the latch. "You need anything else?" She looked at him then, really looked. "If you see any clean cloth or soft wool, we could use it, for swaddling, and maybe a tin of lard if they have it." "For her skin." He nodded once, then pulled the door open and stepped out into the cold. Shiloh listened as his footsteps faded into the distance. She adjusted Clara's blanket and shifted to sit upright, wincing as her muscles protested. The ache ran deep, but she welcomed it. It meant she'd made it through. They both had. She laid Clara down in the crook of the folded cloak and moved stiffly to the water bucket. Her reflection in the surface startled, her face drawn, hair tangled, eyes shadowed. She splashed water over her cheeks and neck, then pulled her braid back into a tighter knot. A rustle behind her made her turn. Clara stirred, face pinching with a whimper. Shiloh crossed the barn and gathered her up again, settling into the straw with her back against the stall wall. The baby quieted almost immediately. "I reckon it's you and me now," she murmured. She hadn't named the father to Isael. Wouldn't. The man had been gone before winter, long before her belly had started to show. She'd thought herself careful, but life had a way of slipping past plans. Still holding Clara, she looked around the barn. A line of bridles hung neatly along one wall. A chest sat near the far door, half covered with a saddle blanket. Tools leaned beside it, an axe, a pair of shears, a worn rasp. Everything here bore Isael's hand. Orderly, quiet, steady. She hadn't expected him to still be alone. An hour passed, maybe more. The wind picked up outside, rattling the barn boards, but the inside stayed warm. When Isael returned, the door opened with a burst of cold and the scent of wood smoke and horses. His arms were full a canvas sack, a folded bundle of cloth and something wrapped in oilskin. "I got what you asked for," he said, brushing snow from his shoulders. Shiloh stood and took the sack from him, setting it down gently. "Thank you." He nodded and crossed to the stove, unwrapping the oilskin to reveal 2 fresh loaves and a wedge of hard cheese. He set them on a clean plank and drew out a knife from his belt. They had wool remnants from the church sewing circle. Not much, but soft enough for her. Shiloh reached for the cloth and ran it between her fingers. "This'll do fine." Isael carved a thick slice from the loaf and handed it to her. She bit into it without ceremony, eyes closing briefly. "They said snow's likely again by tomorrow," he said, not looking at her. "We'll need to move you inside before that hits." Her mouth was still full, so she only nodded. "I wired my neighbor. He's got a sister who midwifes sometimes. She'll come by to check you both in a few days." She swallowed. "You didn't ask if I wanted that." Isael met her eyes. "I didn't think I needed to." Shiloh studied him for a long moment. "You always been this sure?" He didn't flinch. "No, but for this I am." They ate in silence after that, side by side on the blanket-covered floor. When Clara woke again, Isael didn't reach for her, but he watched, his gaze steady as Shiloh tucked the baby beneath her shawl. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I do," he said. "But I'd rather talk about it when your feet are under you." "When you're rested." She nodded slowly, then looked down at Clara. "You'd have made a good father." He sat still for a while, then softly, "Maybe I still could." She didn't answer aloud, but her hand slid over his where it rested on the floor between them, and she didn't pull away. The hearth inside Isael's cabin burned low, casting a faint orange glow across the rough-hewn floorboards. Shiloh sat in the rocking chair that had once belonged to Isael's mother, her legs wrapped in a wool blanket, Clara asleep against her chest. The cabin smelled faintly of pine pitch and bread flour, with a sharper undercurrent of saddle oil and tobacco from Isael's coat hanging near the door. He knelt beside the stove, feeding in another split of cedar. The fire caught quickly, crackling bright. When the room warmed, he stood and leaned his shoulder against the edge of the mantel. "You've been quiet," he said, watching her face in the firelight. "She's heavier than she was," Shiloh replied, her voice low. "Strong like you said." Isael nodded once. "She'll keep growing." "You'll need rest if you're to keep up with her." "I'll rest when she does." "You're allowed to let someone else carry the weight a while." Shiloh met his gaze. "And if I don't know how," Isael crossed the room slowly, pulling a chair near hers. "Then you'll learn." "Same as I did." She shifted Clara gently into the crook of her arm, careful not to wake her. "What did you carry, Isael?" He paused before answering. "Everything my father left undone, this land, the debts, the animals. The feeling that I wasn't enough to keep any of it together." Shiloh's eyes didn't move from his. "And did you keep it together?" I kept going. "That's something." Silence settled between them again, but it was no longer heavy. Isael leaned forward to stir the pot of beans he'd left simmering. The scent rose up, rich and earthy. "I saw the locket you keep in that drawer," he said without turning. "The one with the pressed violets." Shiloh's grip tightened slightly around Clara. "I didn't mean to leave it out. I wasn't prying, I just needed the extra cloth." "Thought maybe it was from your mother." "It was from my sister," she said after a long moment. "She died young. Fever took her before her 16th summer. Violets were the last thing she picked." Isael placed the spoon down gently. "I'm sorry." "She was the one person who never looked at me like I was a burden," Shiloh said. "After she passed, I learned to keep moving." Isael didn't offer sympathy. He just sat back down beside her, his knees brushing hers. "You don't have to keep moving anymore," he said. She looked down at Clara, whose lips twitched in sleep. "I don't know what stillness feels like. You'll learn that too, slowly." Shiloh reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Clara's temple. "What did you think would happen when I showed up?" "I didn't think," Isael admitted. "I just opened the door." She studied him, eyes catching every shadow shift across his face. "And now I'm thinking," he said, "about what it would mean if you stayed." Clara stirred then, her mouth working in search of milk. Shiloh adjusted her shawl, quietly nursing the baby as the fire popped behind them. Isael waited, hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I don't have anything to offer you except myself," she said after a while. "And what's left of me might not be much." Isael reached over, resting his palm against her knee. That's all I ever wanted. The wind scraped softly against the cabin walls, but inside it was warm and still. Shiloh let her shoulders ease just a little and leaned back into the rocker. "I'll stay," she said. Isael didn't smile. He only nodded once, slow and sure, and moved to the cradle he'd built 2 winters ago, back when he thought maybe someone might fill it someday. He brought it near the hearth, laid a folded quilt inside it, and turned to her. "When she's done, I can take her, give you a few hours of sleep." Shiloh looked at him, the firelight catching the edges of her expression. "All right," she said. He stood beside her until Clara had drifted off again, then lifted the baby gently from her arms. Shiloh let go slowly, as though learning how to trust the weight in someone else's hands. Isael laid Clara in the cradle and knelt beside it, one hand resting on the edge until she settled. Then he glanced back at Shiloh. "You can rest now." She leaned her head back, eyes already closing. Isael stayed beside the cradle, watching the rise and fall of his daughter's breath, while the woman he'd waited half a decade for finally slept in his home. The first real thaw came on a Tuesday, the kind of day where the snow softened underfoot and the woods smelled faintly of pine sap waking in the warmth. Isael had been splitting fence rails near the creek when he heard Clara's cry through the open window. He set the axe aside, wiped his hands on his trousers, and headed toward the cabin. Inside, Shiloh was walking the baby slow across the floorboards, her hair still damp from washing. Clara quieted as Isael stepped in, her tiny face turning toward the sound of the door latch. "She's been fussing since breakfast," Shiloh said, adjusting her hold. "Might be her belly." Isael reached for the pot of steeped chamomile near the stove, poured a little into the tin cup she'd kept warm on the hearthstone. "Try a sip of this, then see if she'll settle." Shiloh took the cup, her hand brushing his. "You always this steady with babies?" "No," he said, leaning back against the table's edge, "but I watch close." Clara finally took the breast again, and Shiloh eased into the rocker with a sigh. Isael waited until the quiet had settled again before speaking. "I thought tomorrow we might take her out for a bit, just up the ridge. She's old enough to feel the sun." Shiloh tilted her head. "You sure that won't be too much? I'll carry her. You just walk beside me." "It's not far." She didn't answer right away, only looked down at the child in her arms. Then, "I haven't left this cabin since the storm," he nodded. "That's why I'm asking." Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "All right. If the weather holds." Later that night, once Clara was asleep in the cradle, Isael lit 2 candles and set the table with the last of the venison stew. Shiloh sat across from him, still barefoot, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her knuckles were raw from scrubbing linens that morning. "I've been thinking," she said as she broke off a piece of bread, "about finding work once I'm strong enough, something I can do from here." Isael dunked his bread in the broth, then set it down. "There's no rush." "There needs to be," she said. "I want to carry my weight." He didn't argue. "There's a cattle outfit west of here. They always need mending come spring. I can ask if they'll set aside a few saddle blankets for repair." Shiloh met his eyes. "You'd vouch for me?" "I'd do more than that." She looked away then, toward Clara's cradle. "I don't want to be beholden." "You're not." She stood and gathered the dishes. He didn't stop her while she washed. Isael took his coat from the hook and stepped out into the night. The stars were sharp above the pines, clear and unsentimental. He leaned on the porch rail, listening to the distant creek and the wind brushing over the hard ground. Shiloh joined him after a while, arms wrapped around herself. She didn't speak, just stood beside him until the cold crept through her shift. Then she said, "I used to think if I stopped moving, I'd disappear." "You haven't." She glanced sideways. "No, I suppose I haven't." Isael turned to her, voice low. "What do you want, Shiloh? Not for Clara." "For you." She hesitated, then said, "A place where I'm not waiting to be told to leave." "You're already there." She didn't answer, but her posture shifted, shoulders no longer drawn so tight. He opened the door for her, then followed her back inside. That night, she let him hold Clara after she'd finished nursing. Isael cradled the baby in his arms, his thumb brushing lightly over her small hand. Shiloh sat nearby, watching them both. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows across the walls. "She trusts you," she said quietly. Isael looked down at Clara, then up at her mother. "I trust her too." Shiloh drew her knees to her chest, resting her chin there. "I didn't come here expecting anything, I know. But I want to stay," she said. Isael's gaze didn't falter. "Then stay." She reached for his hand, and this time she held on. By late April, the earth had softened enough to take a shovel. Isael dug a small garden bed behind the cabin, while Shiloh sat nearby with Clara tucked in a sling across her chest. Measuring out the seed stock she'd brought in her satchel from town, a scattering of beans, a handful of turnip, and a parcel of onion sets wrapped in muslin. The air smelled of thawed pine and turned soil, and for the first time in years, she felt time move without urgency. "We'll need to build a fence," she said, watching Isael tamp down the row with the heel of his boot. "Deer'll nose through this in a night. I'll cut posts tomorrow," he replied, straightening. "You still want the corner near the pine for herbs," Shiloh nodded, "if the sun hits it long enough." He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist and looked over at her. "You thinking of selling dried bundles come summer? If I can get a good stand of yarrow and wild mint maybe, could trade with the women over near Bonner's Creek." Isael crouched to gather the tools. "You've always had a mind for making do." "I had to." Her voice wasn't hard, just plain spoken. "But I'd rather build something now, not just last through it." He paused, then looked at the sling where Clara's head rested against her mother's chest. "You're not just lasting anymore." Shiloh ran a hand gently along the baby's back. "No, I'm not." That night the wind shifted. Isael hung a wool curtain across the back window to keep the draft from the cradle, and Shiloh set her sewing aside long enough to help him pull the iron cot near the hearth until they could build a proper crib. Clara had begun to smile, just barely, her mouth twitching at the corners when she fed or heard Isael's voice. He'd taken to humming low and tuneless when he held her, not quite a song, just rhythm and breath. As they settled into bed, Isael reached across the narrow space and took Shiloh's hand. "I've been thinking." She turned toward him in the dark. "That's never a simple beginning. I want to marry you." He didn't rush the words. He said them like he'd already carried them around for days, letting them take shape. Shiloh didn't answer at first. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint creak of the rafters above. "You sure?" she asked finally. "It wouldn't change much, not how we live." "I don't want it to change how we live. I want it to name what we already are." Shiloh's breath caught in her throat not from surprise, but from the sudden clarity of it. This man who had waited without asking, who had welcomed her without condition, was offering her the one thing she'd never thought to want again, a place to belong that was hers by choice, not necessity. "I'd say yes," she said, her voice steady, "if we can do it quiet, just us and Clara." "No preacher, no eyes," Isael smiled, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "I'll carve us rings." They married by the creek 3 days later with Clara asleep in a basket beside them and the water running soft over the stones. Isael had carved 2 simple bands from juniper wood, sanded smooth and rubbed with beeswax. He slipped hers over her finger without a word, and she did the same in return. No vows, no ceremony, just the wind and the trees and the hush of spring opening around them. By early summer, the garden had taken root. Clara had grown enough to sit upright in her mother's lap, her chubby hands reaching for everything: Shiloh's braid, Isael's collar, the wooden spoon she'd claimed as her favorite toy. The 3 of them often took supper outside beneath the lean-to Isael had built for shade, watching the light fade across the ridge. One evening, as they sat together with a pot of beans and cornbread between them, Isael looked at the land around them, the small corral, the clothesline strung between 2 cottonwoods, the rows of onions pushing green through the earth. "You ever think we'd have this?" he asked. Shiloh leaned back against his shoulder, Clara nestled between them, her cheek damp with sleep. "Not once, but I think we earned it." Isael kissed her temple, slow and sure. I reckon we did. When the first frost came that fall, they had put up enough preserves to last the winter jars of blackberry jam, peaches in syrup, crocks of salted beans. Shiloh had traded her dried herbs for wool batting and muslin, sewing a warm quilt for Clara's cot. Isael had taken on farrier work with a family east of the ridge, traveling down twice a month and returning with flour, news, and sometimes sweets wrapped in paper. The days shortened, but the light inside the cabin grew steadier. Shiloh taught Isael how to make a poultice from goldenrod and elder bark. Isael showed her how to oil harness leather and sharpen the drawknife just right. They didn't speak of the past, it didn't chase them here. What they had now was built slowly, with hands and time and care. One evening, as snow whispered against the window panes, Shiloh stood at the hearth with Clara in her arms. Isael came up behind her, wrapping his arms around them both. She leaned back into him, her body fitting against his like it always had. "She's going to grow up here," she said softly. Isael kissed the curve of her shoulder. "With both of us." Shiloh turned in his arms, resting her forehead against his. "You gave me back more than I thought I'd ever hold again." Isael cupped her face, his voice a quiet vow. "You never lost it. You just needed someone to carry it with you." That night, as snow blanketed the roof and the fire burned steady, they lay together with Clara between them, their hands linked over her small, sleeping form. Outside, the world turned cold and still. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and breath and belonging. Not the kind that came from shelter alone, but the kind that was built, wordless and steady, by two people who had chosen one another again and again. And they would go on choosing every day from now until the last.